You are watching Notepad. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. Very recently, the World Bank Group issued a statement saying that within the next 3 to 5 years' time, or between the years of 2024 to 2028, Malaysia will move from an upper middle class economy to a high income economy. And in that report, they argued that the movement of Malaysia towards a high income economy is inevitable. Joining me is the head of World Bank Malaysia, Firas Raad. Dr. Firas, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. And since it's the first week, I still want to congratulate you for taking the time to come to our new home here in Bukit Jalil. Let's move back towards the report. It's also important for us to understand the context of it. And it's also a debate that all of us have been talking about on how, not when, Malaysia becomes a high-income economy status. But it's not easy. In that report, if I can quote the report, the transition is not an easy one. In the past 30 years, only 33 countries have transitioned into a high-income status. So clearly this is, I wouldn't want to call it an exclusive club, but it's a high threshold club to achieve. Let's go into that.
Okay, well, thanks for having me, first of all, Ibrahim, and it's great to be back on your program, and congratulations once again for these nice studios. And as you pointed out, and as we wrote in our report, in fact, it's 19 countries that were able to make that transition over the last 30 years from middle income to high income. So certainly it is possible, and these countries show that there are examples, country experiences where countries can make that journey. Now, there are many other countries who have been stuck in this middle income country group for a long period of time, including Malaysia. And so it's up to these countries sort of to figure out what would make it work so their economic growth rates are high enough to push them over the threshold. And in the past here in East Asia in particular, I think we've seen many countries pursue a certain growth model. And in the World Bank, we call it the growth with equity model. And there are three fundamental features to this model. And this we actually wrote about in one of our recent reports called A Resurgent East Asia. So essentially it necessitates, or it involves, an outward orientation, and this many economies showed. Also some sound macroeconomic management and basic investments in health and education. And with that essential development model, the countries were able to grow. And the growth was driven a lot by factor accumulation, the accumulation of capital and labor. And we saw Malaysia over many decades since, for example, 1972, actually surpassed South Korea for a number of years. And then in 77, South Korea surpassed Malaysia and then took off. But it took one generation from the early 70s to the early 90s for Malaysia to move from low income to upper middle income, or sorry, from middle income to upper middle income. And then it took about another 30 years for it to quadruple its per capita income. And so it's approximating this threshold of high income country status, but it's not there. And we predict, as we wrote in the report, that between 2024 to 2028, depending on different growth scenarios, that it will indeed cross that threshold. But it has to do a lot to prepare itself for that crossing.
All right, let's do an analysis on what does it mean to do more, right? One of them is, of course, not just sectoral outlook, but of course the infrastructure and the framework within it. The democratic status of the country is important to be upheld. The corruption battlements that we are going to be fixated over the next few years, perhaps, the improvement of corporate governance. These are not just taglines or buzzwords. These are real structural, fundamental conversations that need to be had. Do you feel that Malaysia has what it takes to actually deal with all this? Good governance, corruption, independent judiciary, a very strong democracy or democratic process. Where do we stack up against all these other economies versus us in terms of this regard?
So what we're saying essentially, Ibrahim, is that Malaysia needs a new development model, and what worked in the past will not work going forward to drive it towards high-income country status. And essentially, Malaysia needs to shift from this old model that I just described to you to an innovation-based model, growth model. And that will require, as we've said in the report, an enhanced social contract and bold reforms and across different sectors. And what we have said, that those reforms have to come in the way that it can boost or revitalize economic growth. That's very important to improve competitiveness, to enhance jobs, to improve institutions, as you were saying, to improve inclusion, and also to enhance the country's capacity to finance this transition. In all areas, we go into some depth. But essentially, Malaysia has journeyed from an economy based on agriculture to manufacturing, and then from manufacturing to advanced manufacturing and services. And now I think the challenge for Malaysia is how to move from advanced manufacturing and services to also advanced services and innovative products. And that's the next transition that it needs to really affect. But to get there, it has to revitalize economic growth drivers. And there you start talking about investment and how to attract quality investment. How can you improve human capital outcomes? How can you or should you improve female labor force participation? And that perhaps is one of the biggest quick wins that the country can do, is inject much more females into the labor force. And now it stands at around 55%. If it can boost it to 75% through different policy reforms, that would be a big plus. So there's a lot it can do on the growth side, and obviously productivity growth is the major factor. And there, innovation, education, talent management, all of those areas and policies are incredibly important. But Malaysia is in this equilibrium where it has managed to, push growth at a certain level. But as you become richer, as you know, Ibrahim, it becomes harder to sustain those high levels of growth. So it needs to do more to boost productivity. That's number one. And then think of how it improves competitiveness, jobs, governance, and inclusion, and financing, this transition.
One of the
financing,
sorry,
I was going to say just on financing, as you know, it collects relatively, small amounts relative to other countries that are high income.
You're talking about income tax?
I'm talking about revenues, general revenues.
General
17%, 17 to 18% of GDP, whereas high income countries generate much more of that. And as the country
the
grows,
finance minister is already hinting that some form of progressive tax might come into play. Perhaps even the GST. Improvements on how we tax more individuals in a more equitable manner. One thing interesting is that 15% of Malaysia's labour force are paying their income tax, and then of course when you extrapolate that to labour force versus population, only about 7% of Malaysian population is currently paying income tax, which is strange. I would assume a lot of us are working, but not many of us are paying income tax per se. So I understand that there is a conversation that needs to be had in terms of how we can improve on the collection. But things like this can't be done in a shocking kind of manner. It has to come gradually. And because of that, we're looking at policies that has been coming from the government. And since we've had three governments in the past, 3 years, it's also quite important for us to undertake that whole notion of different governments bring about different changes. How does this impact the economic planning of the country moving forward? Do you feel that a stability in governance is important when it comes to this kind of rollout?
Yes, I do. But maybe let me back up and just address the question about taxation. So I think the Ministry of Finance has clearly said that now in the midst of this pandemic and as it's pushing for recovery, that there won't be any tax policy reforms at the moment. But then going forward over the medium term, the country will think of how it has to rebuild its fiscal buffers, and can only do that by generating new revenues. And in our report and in our discussions with the government, we've talked about different options to do that. looking at the personal income tax rate, thinking of how it could become more progressive, looking at capital gains, and looking at the GST, SST, how to make them more efficient. But essentially, the essential point is that Malaysia is going to have to generate more revenue if it's going to finance this transition and improve service standards, living standards, and the money will have to come from somewhere, and that. So they will have to think of ways to do it in a gradual fashion, and where there is confidence, amongst the citizens that this is going to lead to,
where do you think
change.
would be the key areas for increasing revenue for the country? You think?
So the options that I mentioned, I think that they're under consideration over the medium term, and the government will have to decide on how best to take that forward. And then it's not only raising revenues, how you spend it as well. Course.
Yeah, and it's not just about the collection.
Yeah, so there, the different reforms could be considered, and we've talked a lot about social assistance and how it's very fragmented and how it could be made more efficient and streamlined. In terms of social spending, Malaysia spends quite little relative to its GDP compared to other countries. So it could target its social assistance in a much better and more effective way.
Some of your colleagues at the Malaysian World Bank came on the channel and talked about the idea of widening the net, which is more important than deepening the net, i.e. hitting a lot more people rather than some people but entrenched. This kind of notion requires a lot of understanding on how societies work, on how the money can be distributed equally, but this also requires a lot of effort and a lot of energy and a lot of focus and attention to get this done. Do you feel that there can be some form of an improvement to address helping out the social programs in a more efficient way, so that the government can free up their resources and think about something else as well?
Yeah, for sure. I think there more can be done to make the spending efficient, and we've talked about these reforms in our different reports. Actually, BNM's annual report also talked about social protection and what reforms could be done to improve protection, to enhance efficiency. But essentially the countries in this region, and this was pointed out by our chief economist recently in one of his talks here in Malaysia, that countries in this region have relied more on growth than taxation to really protect people and raise living standards. But that, as you grow richer, becomes harder to do, because we were saying, as you climb up the income ladder, you don't see the high growth rates anymore. You actually see them drop a little. It becomes harder to generate the 5%, 6%, 7% growth rates. So if you're in that situation, you have to think of, well, then you need to raise revenue, and if you need to raise revenue, you need to spend it very efficiently. And so I think more could be done to target that social assistance. For example, now the assistance is quite broad. It's not only the bottom 20, it's the bottom 40, and the benefits are quite shallow.
Yes.
And they don't really make a big, significant change in the average household income.
Yes.
So if you really target it very well, make it, instead of 10% of household income or less, make it 20, 30%. So people who are vulnerable actually feel, the impact of that benefit.
Let's talk about wages. For the longest of time, Malaysia is stuck in that middle income wage. And in this report, Aiming High, which our colleagues have just nicely shared with us, which is talking about the next stage of growth here for Malaysia, wage is going to be a big deal for us to move ahead. But when you look at fresh graduates earning about 2,000 plus in KL, it's not enough. It's just not enough. And they're living relative to what their peers are doing outside of KL or Penang or JB, they are living in very close to poverty level, if you think about it. And do you feel that that has to be addressed in terms of how we think about wage structure for the country?
This goes to the subject that we've discussed in the past at length, this question of cost of living and how middle class Malaysians are feeling the pressure. When I actually first came to Malaysia, I was a bit puzzled, Ibrahim, why there was so much talk and discussion about cost of living, because when you look at the average numbers, price inflation, for example, you don't see where those pressures are coming from. But when you look a little bit deeper, you start to understand that maybe it's not a question of price inflation, but more of slow income growth, that wages haven't risen in many years.
Yeah, because the headline inflation we just saw was 0.1%. I mean,
so it's more that. It's more a question of slow sort of income growth. In certain areas, maybe food and housing, you do have high rates of inflation, which affect
healthcare as well. Healthcare inflation
maybe health, but disproportionately affect the poor more than the middle class and the high income. So I think this is a challenge for the country, and the question is, how do you create enough high-paying, high-quality jobs for the youth of the future? And this is where education and skills training come in. And I think the government really has to invest in long-term education reforms to make sure that this workforce is future ready. And now we're a bit concerned about the competitiveness of the average Malaysian graduate in areas of science, technology, and math. The international test scores here compared to those in the aspirational peer group are not where they need to be. And so if Malaysia is going to compete in the future in the global marketplace of goods, services, and ideas with the other economic tigers here in Asia, it has to improve its education outcomes and the overall skill levels of the workforce.
If this pandemic has shown us some of the vulnerable areas that we're facing right now is the education sector, particularly the public education sector, for the middle income, for the upper middle income, as well as the high income households. They don't feel it because they send their kids to non-government schools. But for the 95% of Malaysian students, particularly undergoing through the K-12 education phase right now, they are the most impacted, and by some results have shown that they are either in between 2 months to 4 months behind from their, academic syllabus. I mean, of course, now we're seeing the schools slowly open and all that. That doesn't take away the vulnerability of the Malaysian education sector right now. And this requires a lot of money, literally lots and lots of money, not just thinking and how we should improve on the education sector, but if we can get this right, and this is a big if, I'm sure this can help boost the growth of our country. The problem here is that, do you see a pathway of Malaysia trying to address some issues, for instance, the education sector, in terms of trying to bring that sector up to, say, what we normally see in a high-income nation?
So I think there are several aspects to the narrative. One is getting over the scars of COVID-19. And the scars, I think, have been wide and deep, not only in Malaysia, but in all countries. And there's been a big erosion of human capital accumulation, essentially because, online is really not the same as in person in school. And I think all countries and systems have tried to...
I agree. I mean, my kids are running me up against the wall when they were doing the online lessons, but yes,
so there naturally has been an impact on the quality of education and learning on the part of children. And then going forward, I mean, I would argue, Ibrahim, that it's not only a question of resources. I think maybe the resources have been there for the Malaysian educational system, but it's also the system of incentives and accountability within the system, in the different mini subsystems of the overall education system, that ensures that this child is learning what he or she should be learning from grade to grade. And there's accountability and testing all the time, whether it's national testing or international testing. But that needs to be done, and it's ongoing at the moment. But to try to drive the whole system of principals, teachers, supervisors, policymakers, those responsible for information, to ensure that we're meeting, these standards, and that it takes a lot of investment. And Malaysia has been at it for a while. But in our view, this is an incredibly important piece of policy that Malaysia needs to get right, and it can't afford to wait any longer, because education reform takes a long time to put into motion and then to see the results. And like, for example, countries have changed their curriculum and done it over 7 years, and they don't see the impact on till 7+ or 10+.
Yeah.
But to improve your STEM outcomes, you need to start investing from now, and I think that's the challenge.
But humans, through no fault of ours, are self-serving creatures. It's understandable why people leave the country and bring the talents elsewhere. If anything, it's as simple as because they get paid better somewhere else. And because of that, the only other reason for them to stay back and try to resist this kind of economic temptation is through patriotism, through national ties, that kind of stuff. And that's where we have to touch into the heart of the matter. Do you feel that the country has what it takes to get our act together and try to get ourselves from that upper middle income level to a high income nation status in 3 years' time or in 5 years' time?
So I think this is the challenge ahead of the country. As I said, to embrace a new development model, to move from the old one to the new one, underpinned by this new social contract and a readiness to undertake these reforms that we were talking about in the areas highlighted in the report, to think of what will drive growth, because it's going to be much harder to drive growth, to improve the country's competitiveness in different technology areas, to create high quality and well-paying jobs.
One area, as an economist, you would have to argue that culture plays an important part into an economic behavior. Do you feel that this country's culture can adopt a high-income nation culture, which is high productivity, high innovation, equitable behavior, equal or close to equal female participation, all that? Do you feel that we have that culture in us, or do you feel that there has to be some sort of an impetus for the culture to slightly change a bit in order to adopt this new behavior that we need to, in order for us to achieve that kind of mark?
Yeah, Ibrahim, there are different sort of views and interpretations of how important culture how important culture is and how important other factors are. And sometimes there was this view of East Asia decades ago, and of South America, that there are certain cultural attributes that are not conducive to development, but I think they were proven to be very wrong. And I'm of the view that it's not so much cultural values or attributes, but more institutions and policies. And you look at one example of South Korea and North Korea. They have the same people, essentially, same geography, same culture, same history. But then from 1950 and onwards, you had one system here and another system there, and they developed in different ways. And one succeeded economically much greater than the other one. But I would argue it's not so much culture, but it is policy and institutions, and getting the system of incentives and accountability right. So I think this country has what it takes, but it has to think of what systems and what policies have to be realigned to make sure that leap forward can happen. And it's not impossible. It's been done, as we've said. 19 other countries have done it. And
you've been here for quite a bit, and things might have changed or not changed of your view of Malaysia. What's your personal opinion on the country moving forward, the past 3 years of your observation here?
Yeah, I mean, I've said in the past, I think this is a remarkable country with a incredibly impressive history. And remember, Ibrahim, I come from the Middle East and North Africa region, where we've seen a lot of fragility and failed states. And so I think, you know, Malaysia has succeeded over the decades in modernizing its infrastructure, its economy, its institutions. There have been challenges along the way, but overall, when you look at the record, it's relatively impressive, you know. And to think, you know, you have this the system, I define it as sort of multi-everything, because you have, for example, a multi-monarchy system with a rotating monarchy. You have multiple states, federal and different states. You have multiple ethnic groups. You have 2 different geographic areas separated by 700 kilometers. But, you know, given all of that rich mosaic, you have been able to come together and build a modern nation, upper middle income, that has prospered over 20, 30 years. And now the challenge ahead is how to make the next leap forward. So I think it can happen, but again, I think a new development model has to be embraced, underpinned by this new social contract. And there's another element of that social contract that I didn't discuss, and this is the readiness to embrace the system of open data. And this is something, you know, you talked about me being here for 3 years. This is something that we have grappled with a lot in the World Bank and others, that the readiness to share data with the researchers, universities, international development organizations is not where it should be. And I think the mindset has been getting better. Policies are improving, but they should really improve much better if Malaysia is going to, you know, use data to drive development going forward.
It could be that they're not aware, as simple as that, in terms of embracing a new open data culture.
Yeah, well, it's something that I think many people have been, and institutions have been discussing and highlighting the importance of. But, you know, because you generate data to do analysis, so that analysis informs policy making.
Fantastic.
And that's sort of what needs to happen more.
If people want to learn more about the report, Aiming High and all the other reports, where do they go to?
So they go to our website. We also have a Facebook page, and they can contact us directly as well.
Fantastic. That was our conversation with Dr. Firas Raad, the World Bank of Malaysia. If you've missed any part of this interview, just head on to astroawani.com. Look for the World Bank or Aiming High as a report. I'm sure you can find some interesting news articles as well as some interviews such as this one on the website. Until then, thanks very much for watching. Catch you in the next one.